I mentioned on another video that I was no longer dyeing my hair blonde because of white supremacy. And I said that if other women wanted to know more about that, they should ask me. And many of you did, which is great. It tells me I found the right side of TikTok. So I am Daniella, scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership. I wrote a book called Uncultured about growing up in the Children of God religious cult and going into the cult of the US Army. And you can get signed copies of Uncultured attached here. Then I started working on a book called The Culting of America, which is going to come out next year. And one of the things I talk about that we always see in cults is hair control, right? Appearance control. But that breaks down into hair, body size, body coverage, and underwear, right? So, of course, as I've been deconstructing cults and coercive control myself, plus writing about it, I have been on this journey myself. And so one of the things for me, okay, so I was born like a blonde kid, like a dirty blonde hair, right? Regular little kid blonde hair that grows up to be brown. I have brothers who were born the towhead, super white blonde that people love to cling to. And guess what? As adults, none of us are still blonde because it's very rare for adults to be blonde. It only happens in usually certain parts of the world. And they happen to be the parts of the world that we have been taught under white supremacy produce the most beautiful people, right? But another thing about this is that the way that women, especially white women, are taught to present themselves as grown-ups in America is very tied into PDFophilia, which I, of course, coming from the cult that I came, cannot support that. Right? So being hairless, being blonde, doing the Dagger voice, dumbing herself down, having a perfectly flat stomach, right? All of these things are about looking more and more like little girls, not wearing red lipstick, not having tattoos. All of these things play in, right? And blondness is a big, big part of it. But I had this personal journey with it because I dyed my hair blonde from the age of 14 to the last year. And I, especially in my later years, would think about it and I would be like, I know that I look better as a brunette. I know that I would look better with my natural color. But to me, it just doesn't feel pretty. Like I was like, I just don't. I feel like I have to be blonde to be pretty. And so I spent $20,000 of my life being blonde. I never thought about it any more than that until I was really in the middle of deconstructing. And here was what kind of happened to push my journey a little further. I had already sort of had the crack in the brainwashing with white supremacy. I had already physically and mentally left the cult of white supremacy as much as any of us can that are still living in this country and in this world. And that was when, just as I was selling Uncultured, I got contacted by the Army to ask me to testify against my ex-husband of a decade prior for white supremacy so they could kick him out of the Army. And at that point, I was like an expert on radicalization and extremist thinking. And yet I had to ask myself, right, like how close did I come? How close did I come to using my not insignificant talents of rhetoric and persuasion for the bad guys? And one of the things I knew he wanted me for my whiteness and my blondness, just like the way he used to talk about it, right? I didn't know it then, but I knew it now. And so I've actually written a whole second book called Un-American, which is me going through cult stories and military stories again. But this time, instead of looking outward at the groups around me, I'm looking inward and I'm looking at power and prejudice and whiteness and otherness and what it means to be un-American. And right now that is available on my Patreon. It's a video book of me reading the manuscript, which is not published as a book. I will publish it after I publish Culting of America. But it was me going on this whole journey. And part of this for me was deconstructing beauty and the politics of beauty and the racism inherent in beauty. And this was really important for me because I am Eastern European in descent and in face. And fun fact, the one thing the USSR used to consistently beat the United States on during the Cold War was beauty pageants, because for 400 years we have specifically programmed the world to believe that it is Eastern European beauty, the sharp cheekbones, the sharp nose, the sharp features, and the blondness, of course, that is ultimately very, very attractive, right? And so I knew it. Like, I just kept walking around my townhouse going, oh, he wanted me because of my perfect Aryan face. Gross, right? Literally wanted to pull my face off. So that, all of that, like, really kickstarted my deconstruction, and I had stopped, like, straightening my hair for a while because I wanted to deal with that. I've stopped wearing too much makeup, and especially contouring, right? Because I wanted to look at the white supremacy in that. And I was looking at hair, of course, and as I mentioned, and I came across Tressie McMillan Cottom, who's an amazing Black woman who writes for the New York Times. She's working now on a book called Blonde, about the politics of beauty, and she has written about this. And one of the most controversial things she has ever written or said was, blonde is not a hair color. It is a racial identity. This is why women are so attached to the, I'm blonde. I was blonde as a child. And this is why children who are blonde get so much praise, right? And the one thing she says that stuck so hard and just broke my brain was, if you asked people to make a list of 20 blonde pop stars, nobody would put Rihanna or Beyonce on that list. It's a racial identity. Immediately stopped dyeing my hair and started having this conversation. And another thing that Black women have said to me is, yeah, blonde is like colorism for white people. And I grew up in Latin America. I grew up in Brazil, Peru, and Mexico. And so familiar with colorism, familiar with being praised for being a blonde white child, familiar with dating once a Dominican guy who told me that my mother would love me because I was mejorando la raza. That means bettering the race. And even familiar with having a child, knitting cult baby, who I raised for 5 years as trilingual Portuguese, Spanish, and English, as a little blonde kid who was praised so hard for speaking 3 languages, you know, to the point that it stood out so much that I started asking people if they praised Black and brown children as much for speaking multiple languages. Of course, the answer is no. So that has kind of been my personal deconstruction of blonde, where I was like, yeah, in writing the book, I realized, like, I was destitute. I was in trouble. I needed help. And I got the message from white supremacy that if I looked like blonde Barbie, I would do better in the world. And so I worked very, very hard to transform myself into her. And now I obviously understand that this was white supremacy sort of throwing me a rope. And I grabbed it and I took it, and I feel quite ashamed of that. But more than ever being stuck in shame, I just want to figure out where all these ideas got into my head in the first place. Oh, and one last point was that my child was born without blue eyes, and my husband's family has this color blue eyes, like Caribbean swimming pool blue eyes. And everyone thought she was going to get them because everyone had gotten them. She's the first young in 4 generations to have mama's hazels instead of daddy's blues. And it wasn't just disappointment, right? There was something extra to the edge of disappointment. Like, oh, she was just almost the prettiest, right? She was almost blonde hair and blue-eyed. And then I started to notice, and I really noticed this with the Mormons. And we know one of the reasons that Mormons are so into genealogy is to prove that they have not one drop. And if you didn't know, now you know. But that it's also just become a shorthand amongst white Americans to say, oh, blonde hair, blue-eyed indicates not one drop, which, by the way, is not even true. And I remind you, not one drop racism was too racist for Shizzler. He thought you should be able to earn your way white. Anyways, that has been my journey with blonde. I remind you, blonde is not a hair color. It is a racial category. And do what you want to do with beauty, but don't think that anything is not political or not touched by white supremacy. in the world that we live in.